What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, please know that my voice doesn't always sound this nasally. I just happen to be getting over the gnarliest of colds. My name is Jessica, and every week I sit down here and I talk about a true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. So if that sounds like a good time to you, I'd say subscribe and stick around because I, for one, would love to have you here. Now, normally I try to get into the story rather quickly, but real quick before I do start, I just want to thank you all for your condolences and your sweet words the other week after I posted about losing my grandpa. If you don't care about me as a person, no harm, no foul. Feel free to jump to this timestamp right here to get to the story. But for those of you who do give a hoot, I really do just want to thank you for being so incredibly kind and supportive during what was and is still a very difficult time for a lot of my family. My grandpa was a very cool dude, and it will definitely be an adjustment to move on without him. I do find some comfort in knowing that he was ready to move on. In his own words, he lived a hell of a life, and after years of living in pain, he was ready for the next chapter, whatever that may be. His very last goal here on Earth was to make it to he and my grandma's 68th wedding anniversary, which he did, and he actually passed away 2 days after that. So yeah, in addition to knowing that he was ready, I've also been able to find solace and peace in knowing that he made it to that last goal. And that really was just a testament to who he was. If he put his mind to something, he was going to accomplish it. But yeah, anyways, I just really wanted to thank you guys for being there for me last week, and honestly, for being there for me a lot over the last 3 years. I really do appreciate you all more than I could ever say, and I am so genuinely happy that the internet has brought each and every single one of you into my life in some capacity or another. Whether you know it all or not, you guys have seen me through a lot, and I feel really fortunate to be surrounded by so much love and support and just by so many rad people. Truly, thank you, all of you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being you. But enough blubbering on for me. What do you say we go ahead and get into this case? All right, so today's case is another request. After my Halloween spooktacular, I am picking up right where I left off in going through the request archive. And honestly, the further and further I dig into said archive, I'm starting to think that y'all actually really don't like me that much, because you guys be requesting the most out-of-pocket, gruesome, just horrific cases imaginable. It's like you don't want me to sleep. I really might not be able to ever go on another request spree like this if these stories are the kind of debauchery you're gonna have me looking into week after week. And I can't even call this person out by name because they wanted to stay anonymous, but you know who you are, and my insomnia this week, that's on you. You and this congestion. I'm totally kidding. You all know how much I love you, and I love that you're all just as fucked up and macabre in the head as I am. Today, we're going to be discussing the horrific, grisly, and incomprehensible disappearance and murder of 33-year-old Cassidy Rainwater. And oh, guys, wow. I have no words when it comes to this case, but also all I have is words. So let me stop rambling and actually get the story started. Okay, so today's story, for the most part, is going to take us to Moon Valley Road, which is located near Windyville, Missouri. And Windyville is what's referred to as an unincorporated area, meaning that it's not technically recognized as a municipality, incorporated town, or city. And then to further break that down, an unincorporated area isn't governed by any sort of like local municipality. It's instead governed directly by the county. So in Windyville's case, that would be Dallas County, Missouri. As of the 2020 census, I believe there were only like 54 people registered that lived in Windyville, and all of them were white. Sounds like a lot of bland food and bad dancing, if you ask me, but I suppose there could be a couple of potential benefits to living somewhere so small and so rural. For starters, privacy. You are definitely going to get a whole lot of that living in Windyville. It sits pretty much smack dab in the middle of Missouri, and it's not densely populated, as we just discussed. And then on top of that, it's comprised of primarily dense forests and farmland. So yeah, regrettably, it does serve as basically the perfect backdrop for the absolute turpitude that we're going to be discussing later on. But before we get into that, please allow me to introduce you to the woman that we've all gathered here for today, and that would be Miss Cassidy Rainwater. Cassidy was born in Missouri on June 9th, 1988, to her mother, Tracy Denise Wawasek, and from what I could gather, which admittedly wasn't much, Cassidy appears to have lived in Missouri for most, if not all, of her life. She attended Harrisonville High School in Harrisonville, Missouri. Go Wildcats. But beyond that, sadly, I was able to find little to no information on Cassidy or who she was as a person. And if you've been here for any amount of time at all, you already know how much that's bothering me. I cannot stand that there is virtually nothing available about who this woman was. In my opinion, not having any information about who she personally was lets her life be completely overshadowed by the horrible things that happened to her, and that just really grinds my gears. I do know for sure that she was a mother. She met her first son's father, Ben, in high school, and soon after they began dating, Cassidy found out she was pregnant, and she gave birth to their son in 2005 when she was just 17 years old. Unfortunately, though, Cassidy and Ben really weren't at a point in their lives where they were capable of properly taking care of this little baby. So they did what they felt was the responsible thing, and they gave him up to a family that they felt could give him the life he deserved. And while Cassidy and Ben did eventually go their separate ways romantically, they did remain friends right up until the very end of her life. And what's really unfortunate about Cassidy's life is that she seemed to struggle a lot through it. She just seemed to have a really hard time finding her path throughout her life. And while I can't confirm this with 100% certainty, I can only imagine that her struggle to find her footing in life had to have stemmed from the trauma of losing her mother. Eerily, considering the fact that Cassidy would ultimately lose her life under similar circumstances, Tracy actually disappeared without a trace in April of 2007 when Cassidy was just shy of 19. Tracy's boyfriend at the time told police that he believed she'd gone out to look for arrowheads, and then for whatever reason she never came back home. And sadly, she would never be seen alive again. However, frustratingly, Cassidy wouldn't have answers as to what might have happened to her mother for over a year. And I can't even begin to imagine how traumatic that must have been for her. I mean, you really can't blame her for falling into a mental state that led her to participate in certain self-destructive behaviors. And then to top it all off, on Tuesday, May 6, 2008, a farmer spreading fertilizer in a Laclede County field found clothes as well as several pieces of what he believed to be human remains. And by the end of that very same week, a University of Missouri anthropologist determined via dental records that the remains were that of Tracy Wawasek. And that had to have just been awful. It was kind of like Cassidy lost her mom all over again. And honestly, with what I assume is little to no access to appropriate mental health services or to grief counseling, Cassidy remained on sort of a downward spiral for the next 12 or so years. And her friends and family really did worry about her and worry about how deeply she seemed to be struggling. But no matter what they seemed to do or seemed to offer, it was like Cassidy just couldn't or wouldn't accept their help. I don't know if she was worried about being a burden. I don't know if she just didn't really want to put anyone out, but even Ben in 2019 was so worried about her that he invited her to come and stay with him in Kansas City while they figured things out for her. Like I said, they'd always remained friendly and they'd always stayed in some level of communication even after the romantic portion of their relationship ended. At the very least, they would always talk on the phone every couple of months. like give or take. So when Cassidy mentioned to him in passing that she really wanted to get things back on track and she wanted to get her life together, Ben didn't even hesitate to invite her out to stay with him to do so. And it wasn't just Cassidy that Ben was offering to help. It was she and her second son. Yeah, Cassidy was actually married at the time of her disappearance. She'd met and fallen in love with a man named Zach Paul right around 2009. However, by 2012, the couple had gone their separate ways. They did have a child together though, and technically, even after they broke up, they still remained legally married because they simply didn't have the money to get divorced. Sadly though, at the beginning of 2021, Cassidy and Zach's son was actually removed from Cassidy's custody, and he was placed into the custody of Cassidy's aunt, Cora Terry. And Cassidy was terrified that Zach was going to find out about this. He had moved to Oregon in 2013, and unbeknownst to Cassidy, he had actually already been working towards trying to regain custody of their son from her. And I'm not exactly sure when or how, but Cassidy did eventually find out about this, and understandably, she was pretty hurt and upset by it. But to Zach's credit, he knew that Cassidy had some struggles, and he really was only doing what he thought was necessary to protect his son. So maybe her son was the reason that Cassidy never took Ben up on his offer, because despite this incredibly generous offer, she never did go out to Kansas City. Kansas City, Missouri, by the way. I don't know that I clarified that. But in my defense, it's stupid that there's two of them to begin with. I mean, come on, America. But anyways, for reasons unknown, Cassidy never made the 3-hour journey northwest. And actually, that conversation where Ben had invited her and her son to come and stay with him, that would actually be the last time that Ben would ever hear from Cassidy. And once again, I really don't have a lot of information as to what Cassidy was doing in between this phone call and all of the stuff that we're going to get into, but I do know that she did not have her own place at the time. Rather, she was couch surfing around her friends' houses for quite a while until one day, no one really knew where she was. Now, obviously, she didn't have the most stable lifestyle, therefore it would lead me to believe that it wasn't necessarily the easiest to track her down at any given time. So it did take her friends and family a little longer than one might expect to really grasp the severity of the situation. But eventually, after weeks of no contact with Cassidy, on August 25th, 2021, her aunt Cora actually contacted the Dallas County Sheriff's Office to report Cassidy missing. And although Cora is technically Cassidy's aunt by marriage, I believe, it kind of seems like she played a more maternal or like grandmotherly role to Cassidy. And remember, she had custody of Cassidy's son. So when she hadn't seen or heard from Cassidy in weeks, it was very concerning to her because this was extremely out of the ordinary. Cora explained to police that she had last seen Cassidy following one of their scheduled visitations that Cassidy had with her son, and that following that visitation, she had seen Cassidy get into a silver GMC truck with a man named James. And when asked to elaborate on this James character, I've actually seen it reported that Cora told police that the man's last name was Rainwater, that his name was James Rainwater, and that he lived in a cabin in the woods on Moon Valley Road. And understandably, this was a little confusing to police because according to their identical last names, it appeared that Cassidy and James were related in some way. But once they took the time to actually look into old Jimbo, they would find out that he and Cassidy were not related in any way. James' name was actually James Phelps, not James Rainwater, and according to him, he and Cassidy were just friends. He did tell police that prior to her disappearance, she had stayed with him for a little while, but then in the next breath, he claimed that he also hadn't seen her in quite some time. He told police that he hadn't seen Cassidy since July 25th, which would have been exactly a month prior to Cora Terry's phone call. And according to James, the last time that he had seen Cassidy was when she left his cabin in the middle of the night and never came back. He told police that after weeks of talking about leaving Missouri and moving to Colorado, that when Cassidy got into a random car with an unidentified person at the end of the driveway and drove off, he figured that she'd just finally decided to commit and to make the move out west. And while, sure, this information that James was providing them really wasn't all that helpful, he was cooperative and he, at least at the time, seemed believable-ish. So police really didn't push him or the situation all that much further. Now, they did take note of the fact that the loft area that Cassidy had supposedly been staying in appeared as though it had been completely stripped down and completely cleaned. So much so that, as far as they could tell, there really was no sign, at least obviously visible to them, that Cassidy had ever been there. And like I said, they did find that a little odd, but to hear James tell it, it had also been a month since she'd left. And look, if you stay at my house, I promise you that I've got every trace of the fact that you were ever there, cleaned up and put away before you're even out of my subdivision. So just because it didn't really look like she'd been there, there really wasn't a lot else they could do. And without much else to go on, police did technically open a formal investigation into Cassidy's disappearance, but given her age and her lifestyle, it's my understanding that they didn't really do a whole lot else until almost a month later. And honestly, and this is just my own speculation, but had this next thing not happened, I can only assume that they likely would have continued to do virtually nothing to further the investigation into Cassidy's disappearance. However, given what I'm about to get into, that really wasn't much of an option. So Cassidy was last seen on July 25th, and she was reported missing on August 25th. After which, from what I can gather, police didn't really do all that much to investigate over at least the next 2-ish weeks. That is until, out of nowhere, on September 16th, 2021, the Dallas County Sheriff's Office received a phone call from the FBI. And this phone call was in reference to a tip that they'd received from an anonymous source containing a series of photographs that had allegedly come from the dark web. Now, these photos, which appeared to have come from a server in Germany, were contained to a single file folder named Cassidy. And within this folder, police were horrified to discover multiple images of what appeared to be Cassidy Rainwater, naked and held against her will in a very large cage. And as if that wasn't horrifying enough, the remaining photos were ones that depicted Cassidy's body bound to a gantry crane device and in progressive states of evisceration and dismemberment. Yeah, what? And in case you're unaware, like I was prior to researching this case, a gantry crane is a large and horrifying device commonly used for processing wild game. So the thought of rigging a human up to it is nothing short of medieval. And what's worse is that given certain features of the property that all of this appeared to be taking place on, they believed that the photos had actually been taken on James Phelps' property. Remember Jim? I let her stay here out of the kindness of my heart, and then she disappeared into the night. Jim? Yeah, as far as police could tell from these photos, they had been taken on his Moon Valley Road property. To clarify, he had conveniently left out this little series of events when speaking to police following Cassidy being reported missing. Obviously, this gave police more than enough probable cause to secure a warrant, which they did just before prancing their happy asses right back on out to Old Moon Valley Road. And once they arrived back out to James' place, they served him with their warrant and they began their search. And to James' detriment, this warrant did encompass some of his electronics. So those particular items were seized and searched as well, most notably his phone, on which they found 7 additional unsavory photos of Cassidy, which ultimately led to his immediate arrest. Ultimately, James ended up being arrested and taken into custody the very same day that the FBI tip came in. He was carted off his property in cuffs and subsequently booked into the Dallas County Jail. And once James had been removed from the premises, the Dallas County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and the Greene County Sheriff's Office all began to process their apparent crime scene. And as these agencies executed search warrants, which overall took about a week ish. Oh my God, did they find more than I assumed they ever imagined they would. Not only did they locate the exact gantry crane from the photos behind the residence, they also discovered potential blood evidence inside James' home. However, the real kicker were packages that they found in his freezer that appeared to contain human flesh. Yeah, guys, this is Adam Strong all over again. Skeletal remains believed to be Cassidy's were also found on the property adjacent to James' property, which coincidentally actually happened to belong to Cassidy's own grandfather. To clarify, this in no way implicates her grandfather in being involved in this. He'd been dead for a few years before this. He'd left the land in a trust prior to his death, but either way, it is really eerie to think that her remains were technically found on her own family's property. And these skeletal remains, as well as the forensic evidence from inside the house and inside the freezer, eventually all were confirmed via DNA to have belonged to Cassidy. And given the dates that were marked on the packages of flesh that they discovered in the freezer, because yes, that was a thing, it was believed that Cassidy was murdered almost immediately after she had last been seen alive. And as if all of that wasn't enough, what was completely unbelievable, aside from everything about this case, was the fact that a comprehensive forensic examination of James' phone uncovered a couple of text messages that very much implicated yet another person in the absolutely horrific and atrocious things that police were uncovering had happened to Cassidy. Timothy Norton, at the time, was a 56-year-old long-haul trucker who, when not out on the road on a haul, claimed that he lived primarily out of his vehicle. And well, that's all fine and dandy, whatever. What was a little interesting was that Tim's legal address was listed as 386 Moon Valley Road, the very same property that James Phelps owned and that it was believed Cassidy had been held captive and murdered on. And Tim had had his address listed as the Moon Valley Road property for years. This wasn't some new development that he could claim had taken place after Cassidy disappeared. No. This was decades in the making. Uh-oh. But that wasn't even actually what had piqued their interest into Timothy Norton in the first place. No. That had actually been the text message correspondence between he and James that they discovered on James' phone. In these conversations, the two men appeared to be plotting, planning, and scheming, premeditating, if you will, 33-year-old Cassidy Rainwater's murder. Now, evidently, James and Tim had known each other for years. They'd both served in the military. They'd both been unlucky in love, racking up, I believe, a combined 3 divorces between the two of them.
3 divorces! 3 divorces!
Oh, and they even referred to each other as family. So, yeah, they were definitely plot a murder over text. Close. Timothy Norton was first interviewed by police on Sunday, September 19th, 2021. And during this conversation, Timothy vehemently denied having any involvement or even knowledge of Cassidy and or her disappearance / murder. And I have to admit that this is an area of the story where the details are a little murky, because you'd think just having proof that he'd spoken to James about murdering Cassidy over text would be enough to arrest Timothy. But for some reason, he wasn't actually formally detained or formally arrested until 2 days after that first conversation. So they spoke to him for the first time on September 19th. He denied being involved in anything that may or may not have happened to Cassidy. They let him go. The next day, they brought him back in for another interview where they called him out on some inconsistencies in his original story. And once he was confronted with his own lies, that is when he supposedly started to crack just a little, admitting to simply helping James to restrain Cassidy at one point. He explained to police as well as to FBI agents that James had had him come over while Cassidy was sleeping on the living room floor. Obviously, this left her incredibly vulnerable and easily accessible. And once he was in James' house, I guess he held Cassidy's legs down while James strangled her and then put a bag over her head. He then told them that once Cassidy was dead, he and James had to take a little break because, it was hard work for them. And then once their respite was complete, That is when they took her outside and they bound her to the gantry crane, which is where we know that the evisceration and dismemberment of Cassidy's body took place. And when all that was said and done, which Tim claims that he had no hands-on involvement in, by the way. So once James was done with that portion, that is when Tim, he tapped back in and he helped James get what was left of Cassidy's body back into the house and into the bathtub, which I guess is where they finished the job. And according to the Dallas County Sheriff's Office, this conversation took place on September 20th. However, most sources that you'll come across say that Tim wasn't arrested until the following day. So I'm not really sure what the disconnect there is, but the important thing is that ultimately Tim was arrested, and just like his buddy, he was also booked into the Dallas County Jail, where he too would be held without bond. And although the men were initially only booked into the jail on charges of kidnapping, not surprisingly, given what a small town this was all taking place in, as word of James and Tim's arrests began to spread, so did just rumors on rumors on rumors. But before we get into that, I'm going to take my break, throw on my lashes, and when we get back, well, the rumor mill, it be rumor milling. Don't go nowhere. All right, so we're back, and before we took our break, I mentioned that rumors surrounding Cassidy's disappearance had started spreading around Windyville like crazy. I mean, people began spreading around that Cassidy had been discovered dead, skinned, and hanging from a tree. There were rumors going around that James and Tim had planned to sell Cassidy's meat on the dark web, and speculation even swirled that this was like a long-standing business operation that the men had been running for something close to 2 decades. I mean, the actual facts in this case are wild enough, but damn, these people were coming up with some dark shit. Honestly, though, you really can't blame people in the town for talking and for trying to piece things together themselves. Because despite the obvious fear that had been running rampant through the community in light of James and Tim's arrests, the Dallas County Sheriff's Office was remaining incredibly tight-lipped. And obviously that's to be expected to a certain degree when you're dealing with an ongoing investigation, but you think they'd at least give enough information to give the community a sense of calm. People were scared, and instead of trying to mitigate that fear, Dallas County Sheriff Scott Rice went completely on the defensive, almost shaming people for wanting answers to their questions. He publicly stated that 99.999999999% of what was going around was complete crap. And then he went on the record stating, quote, "While I understand the impatience and curiosity of the people, I'm going to give you a piece of advice. It is not a good idea to listen to a crime reporter / blogger or a TikToker that is sitting in their apartment or their mommy and daddy's basement eating great value cheese puffs and drinking boxed wine with grand intentions of being a social media superstar," unquote. First of all, I am offended. All jokes aside, though, I can completely understand a level of frustration that law enforcement could feel towards the true crime genre if ever the coverage were to negatively impact an ongoing case. That's actually one of the reasons that I don't love covering new or developing cases here, because I'm not a professional of anything. So I find it more responsible to gather my information from professionals or from vetted sources, which I can then filter through my own opinion. But I think to call 99.99999% of what was going around pure crap was a bit hyperbolic. Obviously, some of the information going around was over the top, but given what we do know about the gantry device and the evisceration and the cage and the packaged up human flesh, some of it doesn't really appear to be all that far-fetched. And like I said, the public hadn't really been given any reassurance up to that point that the information they were hearing wasn't true. And again, I understand that police can't jeopardize their investigation just to pacify the public, but I do think that at the very least, the surrounding community was entitled to something. Bare minimum, they deserve to know whether they were safe or not. And I mean, this next part isn't really here nor there, nor is it meant to come across as like self-aggrandizing, but to essentially condemn the entire true crime community as a whole. It is a little bit insulting. I mean, not only does the community tend to cover cases that would oftentimes otherwise be completely forgotten by traditional media, let's not forget that there have been cases that have benefited dramatically from coverage just like this, from so-called web sleuths who likely have more time to dedicate to one particular case than traditional investigators do, especially when it comes to cold cases. I mean, we saw that in the Terry Rasmussen case. Remember when Rebecca Heath, on her own free time and with her own determination, helped to identify 2 Jane Doe murder victims after they'd stayed unidentified for 32 years? And while I understand that developments that extreme are few and far between, let's not completely write off the potential benefits of people in this community who really are here to do good. Seriously though, trust and believe that I know that that's not everyone, because there's absolutely people on the other end of the spectrum who just talk out of their asses or do things without even using their brains. Be it that TikTok psychic who baselessly accused that Idaho professor of being involved in the Idaho 4 murder, or that third person who charged people to look again in Stauch's autopsy photos. Basically, this all just proves that, like with any group of people, there are people in this community who truly do care and who truly do want to be responsible. And then there are people who are completely self-serving and who are just in it for their 15 minutes of fame. And unfortunately, as the consumer of this content, it is your responsibility to gauge who you're supporting and who you're giving your social media currency to. The best advice I can give you is to consider the source, consider the information, and consider the motive. And in spite of what Sheriff Rice says, don't count someone out just because they drink box wine or because they film in a basement. But also, don't automatically trust someone just because they have an official title or a massive following. Because sometimes those are the people with the worst intentions. Anyway, yeah, sorry, I don't really know where that tangent came from, but getting back to Cassidy. There seems to have been a lot of secrecy and a lot of weirdness surrounding her case pretty much the whole time. I've actually seen numerous different accusations hurled at the Dallas County Sheriff's Office regarding her case throughout my research. Mainly being that the case seemed very hush-hush, to the point that a lot of people in the area seemed to wonder if maybe they had a vested interest in keeping some of the grislier details under wraps. And again, that's just speculation. I am not stating it as fact. I'm not stating it as fiction. As always, I encourage you to do your own research and to form your own opinions outside of just the scope of information that you hear here today. But what's even more disconcerting are the accusations that the sheriff's office isn't just trying to keep details under wraps, but some people in the area actually believe that they're going out of their way to cover up certain aspects of the case. It was late in the morning on Monday, October 4th, 2021, when emergency services were dispatched to James Phelps' Moon Valley Road property in response to a call about a fire. And by the time fire crews arrived, the entire property was completely engulfed in flames. It took hours for these crews to put the fires out and for them to get control of subsequent hotspots. I mean, this fire was massive. And unfortunately, by the time it was extinguished, there was nothing left of the property, save for some ashy rubble. A preliminary investigation into the cause of the fire later led to the discovery of what was believed to be a tripwire, and this prompted a call to nearby Springfield in request of assistance from their bomb squad. And once the bomb squad arrived on the scene, that is when they came across 2 additional incendiary devices. And from my understanding, these are devices or weapons that are specifically designed and constructed to start fires. These ones in particular were made out of mortar tubes, balloons, and coiled fuses, and for detonation purposes, they were then attached to tripwires. And I guess there were 3 of these in total. They found 2 after the fire, and then there was the one that was assumed to have started the fire. Once the remainder of the property had been cleared, the bomb squad did safely detonate the 2 remaining devices, and I believe that was around 1:30 a.m. on Tuesday, October 5th. And frustratingly, as I alluded to before, the fire at Moon Valley rendered the property a total loss, according to Dallas County. And after an extensive subsequent investigation, the Missouri State Fire Marshals classified the fire a second-degree arson. So from my understanding, first-degree arson would be if a person was hurt or killed during the course of a deliberately set fire. And then second-degree arson is used to classify deliberately set fires that only cause significant property damage or destruction, so like no fatalities. And while it goes without saying that it's obviously a massive relief to know that no one was hurt in the fire and to know that the other devices were found and detonated safely, there are definitely still some things about this fire that made residents in the area they've got some questions. Questions like, how did everyone miss these tripwires during preliminary searches of the property? Or how did the house burn down completely while supposedly under supervision by the authorities? I mean, Tim and James were set to appear in court the very next day, and now the scene of their alleged crimes is just gone. If anything, this fire had the potential to work out in their favor, given that significant evidence was probably lost to the fire. Again, all while supposedly under lock and key and constant supervision by authorities. Which might explain the suspicion that some people have that maybe, perhaps, there's a chance that conceivably the fire may have been started by someone closer into the investigation than we'd be comfortable to believe. Again, that is speculation. I cannot stress enough that these are just rumors and just theories that I've seen floating around, but you do have to admit that it is very interesting and very puzzling that this fire was able to not only start, but to get this out of hand whilst it was meant to be being constantly supervised. Not to mention that the very next morning, there were news crews traipsing all up and down the property, picking up and sprinkling handfuls of debris for dramatic effect as they read off their teleprompters. All this before it would have even been possible for the complete arson investigation to have been performed. I don't know. It all seems negligent at best and possibly corrupt at worst. At any rate, though, despite the fire at the Moon Valley Road property, James Phelps and Timothy Norton did still appear in court for the first time as scheduled on October 5th. They were both present via Zoom, and the hearing itself, to my knowledge at least, was simply to set a date for their formal preliminary hearing, and that was set for November 5th at like 9:30 in the morning. Following their initial arrests and bookings, the men were eventually separated and held in separate jails pending their trial, and I assume this was in an effort to prevent them from conspiring together any further. I mean, we've seen what kind of things that these men get down to while they're together, so yeah, probably best to keep them separate. James was kept at Dallas County Jail, while Timothy Norton was eventually moved to Greene County Jail in Springfield. But apparently he didn't plan to stay there because, according to court records, his attorneys actually tried to file a motion to have his bond reconsidered in hopes that he could possibly be released from jail pending his trial. Thankfully, that was not approved, and my guess is that that had to do with what was flying down the pipeline at these men, because just shy of 4 months after Cassidy went missing, Tim and James were finally charged with her murder on November 17th, 2021. They were charged with first-degree murder and abandoning a corpse, in addition to the kidnapping charges that they'd both initially been booked in on. And these additional charges were filed following the official DNA confirmation that the skeletal remains, as well as the human remains from the freezer. In November, it was proven that that all was a genetic match to Cassidy. Actually, prior to the fire, more than 200 pieces of biological evidence were recovered from the home and from the adjacent property. And in my opinion, this would lead anyone with a brain in their head and eyes in their skull to the conclusion that Cassidy had been murdered and dismembered there. Following the amendments to their charges, James Phelps appeared in court on November 19th, and during this hearing, the prosecuting attorney told the court that apparently James and Tim would lurk around Walmart to try and pick out potential victims. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they also tried to lure other victims to them via the internet. Specifically, young girls between the ages of 12 and 14 seemed to be of particular interest to them.
Disgusting!
Thankfully, though, given this information and the, in my opinion, obvious fact that releasing either of these men on bond could lead to more victims, Judge John C. Porter did uphold the initial no bond ruling despite James' attorney's request for reconsideration. In fact, Judge Porter stated, quote, "There is no amount of money or other conditions like house arrest that would ensure he wouldn't try to flee or to harm someone else." And I completely agree. However, even with all the seemingly damning evidence that there already was against these men, both men maintained their innocence and pleaded not guilty. Yeah, these two-bit, no brain cell having ass human embodiments of a Band-Aid in a salad. I swear to God. I mean, I get that that's their prerogative, I guess, but not guilty? Bitch, where? You would think that doing what I do and looking into as many cases as I have, that nothing would surprise me anymore, but you would be wrong. Because the fact that these men not only thought that they had a prayer in hell of being acquitted, but that they actually thought that they could finagle themselves bond in the meantime, get the fuck out of here. Thankfully, though, as we've discussed, both men were held without bond pending their further court proceedings, next of which, at the time, were scheduled for early February 2022. Yeah, Timothy Norton was scheduled to be in court on February 8th, 2022, and James Phelps was scheduled for February 18th, 2022. And actually, coincidentally, that was right around the time that it was discovered that Timothy Norton, remember when I said that young girls seem to be of particular interest to these two perverts? Yeah, files on Tim's computer apparently confirmed that, if you catch my drift. And honestly, thinking back, I do feel like I've kind of inadvertently, throughout the course of this video, made James seem like, I don't know, like he was worse than Tim. But rest assured that that is not the case. They're both trash. But just for like explicit clarification, this material, discovered on Tim's computer, was described as especially violent in nature. So, yeah. Tim was arraigned in February of 2022, and in July of 2022, James Phelps followed suit. He too was arraigned, and he pled not guilty. And following their arraignments, their cases moved to circuit court, where they would ultimately be scheduled for trial. However, trials neither men would see, because after almost 2 years of unwaveringly proclaiming their innocence, both men accepted separate and slightly different plea agreements. On Friday, April 28th, 2023, James Phelps entered an Alford plea, which basically means that he acknowledges that he would likely be found guilty if he did go to trial, but he maintains his innocence. Essentially, he's saying that although it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's not a duck, but he could see how you might come to the conclusion that it is. And in response to this, James was sentenced to life in prison with absolutely no possibility of parole, which is good because that's exactly what he deserves, to rot in a cage, similarly to how he tortured Cassidy. And in true Goon Squad fashion, shortly after James accepted his plea deal, Tim did the same. The only difference was that Tim actually entered a guilty plea, also earning himself a big ol' sloppy wet life sentence with no possibility of parole. In exchange for their agreeing to forego a trial, both men had their charges reduced solely to murder, which ultimately saved them from facing the death penalty. And I assume that that's why they did both end up taking their respective deals, because I cannot imagine a jury or a judge in the world that would not find these two men guilty and that would not hold them responsible to the furthest extent of the law. The only frustrating thing about the fact that both of them ended up taking pleas is that without a trial, there is just so much that we'll almost certainly never know. And even though I guess, yeah, technically justice has been served and the responsible parties are behind bars where they belong, I don't know. Something about this case just seems so unfinished to me. I just have so many unanswered questions. Why Cassidy? Why the pictures? Who sent the pictures in? What were they gonna do with her meat. I mean, the list goes on, as do the conspiracy theories surrounding this case. I mean, from the moment the property on Moon Valley Road burned down, residents of the town have been speculating that some higher-ups might be involved, that the house and the crime scene were burned down on purpose to cover up involvement of powerful people in the area. And even those who aren't willing to go as far as to cry corruption certainly believe that the sheriff's department, at the very least, dropped the ball here. I've even seen some people claim that Sheriff Rice and his men were the ones who leaked all of the information in the first place, all of the information that began the rumor mill. Supposedly, they leaked it, and then when it got out of control, that's when they tried to turn around and condemn the community for perpetuating the very same rumors that they had allegedly started in the first place. I mean, the whole thing is just a big clusterfuck, and rightfully so. People are pissed. People were scared. They wanted information and they wanted answers. And rather than honestly sharing as much as he could, residents believe that Sheriff Rice instead lulled them into a false sense of security in hopes that details of the horrific crime wouldn't become like widespread public knowledge. Because let's be real, the fact that this all was going on right under their noses, going completely undetected, I mean, it doesn't look great. So in my opinion, to cover their own asses, it seems like they tried to keep things hush-hush and basically gaslight concerned residents into believing that the rumors were false and that everything they were hearing had been totally blown out of proportion. And this isn't the first time that the county kind of sort of seemed to try and twist the narrative surrounding a crime to their benefit. And ironically, one of the other times was in 2008, following the discovery of Cassidy's own mother's remains. At that time, the county sheriff claimed that Tracy's death investigation was being used for political mudslinging, and that because anthropologists who were tasked with investigating her case never found any trauma on her bones, that her death might not have even been a murder to begin with. And then from there, it seems like, once again, everything was pretty much swept under the rug with hopes that no further questions would be asked. And rightfully so, back then, the community was just as pissed. They felt like law enforcement put absolutely no effort into looking into Tracy's death. And need I remind you that prior to the anonymous tip coming into the FBI, they really didn't seem to be putting all that much effort into investigating Cassidy's disappearance either. And while I don't think that Cassidy and her mother's deaths are related in any way, the shortfalls within their separate investigations do beg the question, what's the deal? Do the sheriffs in the area just not like a lot of attention on stuff like this because it makes them look bad? Or do they not like a lot of attention on this stuff because, well, something deeper is going on? Your guess is as good as mine. I will say, though, that one thing I don't think I'm guessing on is that I do not think that Cassidy was the first victim of these inbred hicks. I just cannot possibly fathom that luring her into this trap, stringing her up on this gantry device, dismembering her, photographing it the way they did, posting it to the dark web, packing up her meat. I mean, I don't know about you, but to me, none of that screams, this is our first time. And the fact that the state prosecutor gave these two plea deals without getting any additional information about other possible victims or other possible perpetrators, to me, that was definitely a missed opportunity at the very least. But to some more tinfoil hat wearing folks, well, they believe that it's actually indicative of a wide-scale cover-up. Again, your guess on that is as good as mine. I don't know. This case just, wow. It is absolutely nauseating to try and imagine what Cassidy must have gone through. Because remember, she was still alive in some of these photos. So she was very much aware of at least some of the horrific things that were either happening to her or were going to happen to her. And I just cannot even imagine the fear and helplessness she must have been feeling, knowing that she was completely at the mercy of these just absolute disgustoids. And just regardless of what you believe, I think I can speak for all of us when I say that I hope that wherever she is now, she's resting peacefully and that she is finally free of whatever vices she was plagued by while here on Earth. And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. Do you think Cassidy was the only person to ever fall victim to these limp dick losers? Or do you think that there were others out there that we just may never know about. Do you think there were more people involved than just these two? Do you think something deeper is going on over in the Ozarks? Or do you think that Tim and James were just two randos who happened to capitalize on the wide open spaces and sparse population of this tiny little town? I really am genuinely curious to get your guys' thoughts down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. And thank you so much to you know who you are for requesting this one, even though I truly may never enjoy a meal ever again. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the request submission form that I have linked down below in the description box. And while you're down there, you will also find all of the details and links for the products I used throughout today's video. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos almost every week. I really strive to post for 4 consecutive weeks before I take a scheduled skip week, but y'all, life has just been throwing me some curve balls lately. So if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always know when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys. Hot. What the fuck was that? Oh, come on. What was that? That's just not the kind of energy I need right now. I don't like that. I need to know what it is before I decide if I care or not. Better not come at me. I'll drop that motherfucker. Oh, it's gonna fly at my face. Y'all are about to see something really special. Aww. My husband just sent me that picture of our cute little doggy. And once the bomb squad arrived, on the scene, damage is the only. What?